fire, the frogs, and everything else that goes with it. It was Jesus. They come to Him and they say, show us a sign. Turn more water into wine. To raise another person from the dead. And without that they would not believe, He says. But of course the Greeks were no different, except that they were looking for something different. They were looking for wisdom. They were looking for something profound and insightful, philosophical, rational. That had to do with the mind, that we could just dazzle one another with it. I came across this argument for the existence of God this past week. This was produced by a monk back in the Middle Ages. In fact, he lived in 1033 and 1109. His name is Anselm. A-N-S-E-L-M. A monk. And he called this the ontological argument for the existence of God. Now, ontological is this idea, as in is the Greek word that means to be. But I like ontological. Are you ready? Now listen, you need to be sharp. Okay? Listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. And I'm quoting exactly from this guy. Here we go. Here's his argument for the existence of God, the wisdom of the world. Clearly, that then which a greater thing cannot be thought cannot exist in the understanding alone. For if it is actually in the understanding alone, it can be thought of as existing also in reality, and this is greater. Therefore, if that then, which a greater thing cannot be thought is in the understanding alone, this same thing, which a greater thing cannot be thought, is that then, which a greater can be thought. And obviously, this is impossible. I'm not done. Therefore, there certainly exists, both in the understanding and in reality, something than which a greater thing cannot be thought. End quote.
Oh.
Do you get it now? The ontological argument for the existence of God. Now here's where it all boils down to. If we can conceive of a greater possible being, then it can exist. That's his argument there. I am so thankful for the word of the cross. The message of the cross. And that's why the Apostle Paul concluded, but we preach Christ crucified. To Jews a stumbling block, because there was no sign that came except the sign of the cross, and that was a stumbling thing to them. And to Gentiles it was foolishness. Well, who could believe that a man dying on a cross could bring salvation, could bring hope, could bring purpose into life, could bring happiness to mankind? But to those who are called, Jew or Gentile, Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. When the Apostle Paul went to Galatia, and there he preached to the brothers and sisters on his missionary journey, he preached to them, I wonder, did he preach to them about the purpose-driven life? Did he preach to them about the power of now? Did he preach to them about their best life now? I mean, did he go there rather than pump them up with health and wealth and with positive mental thinking that if you give your life to Jesus Christ, that life is going to be so much better? I don't know, maybe he did. Maybe somewhere he factored in there the whole idea that, of how important it is that we have financial principles and live debt-free. Because I think of what he told Timothy, the love of money is the root of all evil, all sorts of evil. But there is one thing I do know. That when he left those people in Galatia, they had seen Jesus. Galatians 3, verse 1. You foolish Galatians, as he writes back to them. Who has bewitched you? Who has beguiled you? Before whose eyes, your eyes, as he writes, Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. Look, they weren't there when Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem on that hill and outside of Jerusalem. on the place of the skull. They weren't there. They didn't see it. And yet Paul is able to write to them and say, but you have seen Jesus crucified. Where did they see Him? They saw Him in the speech. They saw Him in the preaching of the Apostle Paul, that he presented Christ crucified. He said, I laid a foundation which no other person has laid, and that foundation is Jesus Christ. And if anyone else tries to, sand. Sinking sand. And in that message, the message of the cross that will serve, brothers and sisters, as the foundation upon which every other doctrine and every other practice that you and I engage in must be built. Anything else will not stand. And so the presentation of the text that we read this morning, Pilate scourges Him. He puts on a crown of thorns and a purple robe. Pilate brings Him out, and he utters these three words: behold the man. No more prophetic words could have been said by a Gentile. Behold the man. Now Pilate didn't say those words as a point of profession of faith. He washed his hands of the whole situation. Have your way with them. It was actually a staged event. It was some for a political amusement and effect. He didn't confess the wonder of the Son of God and behold the man. No. For him, it was mockery and scorn for the false accusations that he knew the religious Jewish leaders were bringing against Jesus. Pilate didn't have a clue, I don't think, that he knew what he was saying, that he was in effect speaking of the redemption that ultimately lived within this Christ, this man, Jesus Christ. Regardless, the Apostle Paul says, of whether that has been preached, behold the man, as being preached out of scorn or derision or envy or strife, selfish ambition, whether out of pure motive or love, he says we rejoice that Christ is preached. It must be the kingdom culture we create, regardless of the society around us, because Jesus, God, would have all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. For there is one God, one mediator also between God and men, the man Jesus Christ, who gave Himself as a ransom for all, the testimony born at the proper time. And understand something, brothers and sisters, that's why we will always be viewed as narrow-minded, bigoted, intolerant people, because there is salvation in no other person. For there is no other name under heaven that has been given among men by which we must be saved. Acts 4, verse 12. And to effect real change in this world, first in our own lives, in this church, in this community, in this state, in this world, we must allow Jesus to reign supreme in our minds and our hearts. We must surrender our wills to His guidance and His direction. The way that is done is through an instrument of death. And we call it the cross, in which we die to self. And so Paul would say in Galatians 2 verse 20, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. Real change. Real change we can believe in comes through the cross of Christ.